Just a week ago, on the streets of Amsterdam, Israeli fans of Maccabi Tel Aviv were experiencing what we call a pogrom. They were beaten up, they were cursed at, they were treated in ways that we wouldn't even want to remember the connotation to where it brings us to. And because of that, we are here with two professionals in the Jewish world, and we're going to talk about anti-Semitism. So hello to Mark Levin, the CEO of the National Coalition for Euro-Asian Jewry. You're based here in DC. And Dr. Zohar Raviv, International VP of Education for Birthright Israel, and a very well-known thought leader in the Jewish world when it comes to Jewish education. So maybe we'll start with you, Mark. We were speaking before the broadcast, and you were saying how, in your opinion, what we see around the world now, the manifestation of anti-Semitism, actually was beginning in the area that you cover, Euro-Asia. Care to elaborate?
Yes. First, thank you for including me today. Pleasure to be sharing the panel. I wish we were here under better circumstances, both directly related to Ukraine, but also for the larger Jewish world and obviously 100%. The state of Israel. My organization, NCSEJ, has been dealing with the issue of anti-Semitism literally for decades now. Mm-hmm. What we saw after the breakup of the Soviet Union is really a precursor of what we're experiencing now, which was a rise in popular anti-Semitism, sometimes fueled by certain governments, but most of the time it was a coming together of the far left and the far right. We used to call it the Red-Brown Coalition. Mm-hmm. They agreed on very few things, but when
now
they came together...
Red-Green Coalition,
right,
whatever, yeah.
So this is something that we have tried to address, literally, as I said, literally for decades with governments, to get them, one, to recognize when a problem exists, how to then deal with the problem. Is it through passage of laws, enforcement of those laws, education, outreach to cultural and other types of iconic figures? Mm-hmm. It's been a multi-pronged approach, but I have to say, what we've seen over the last few years is not something I don't think any of us could have ever imagined happening in the early part of the 21st century.
Right, 100%. Zohar, you want to kind of continue with his thought? And it's interesting because until you said that, I didn't realize, of those extremes getting together, I guess in the 90s?
It started in the 90s, but it was there before. I mean, I think
obviously, right?
No. But I think what people didn't realize, one thing that happened during the Soviet era was the masking of nationalism, mm-hmm. ultra-nationalism, extremism. Mm-hmm. With the implosion of the Soviet Union, all of a sudden, it was like lifting a rock, mm-hmm. and all of those horrible things that were underneath the rock.
It's kind of what it felt like in Amsterdam, I think, on Friday. It was just like people just woke up and their inner beliefs just exploded out there. So, Zohar, happy to hear your thought.
First of all, thank you for inviting me, and I'm honored to be with you on this panel. As a matter of fact, I think that there are far greater experts than me to speak about the history and the ramifications of anti-Semitism in the Jewish world. However, you invited me to speak about it from an educational perspective,
100%.
Which I believe should be viewed from a strategic rather than a tactical standpoint. And what I mean by that is that we need to make a very clear distinction between what I call the site of anti-Semitism and the vision of how to deal with anti-Semitism. And where it comes to the site of anti-Semitism and its context, I wholeheartedly agree with my colleague and everything that he has led in fighting anti-Semitism. From an educational standpoint, however, and this is my main message, is that fighting anti-Semitism should never be a goal, but rather should be an outcome. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that Jewish, Israel, and Zionist education should focus on the inner mechanisms of Jewish life, its values, its ideas, its controversies, its discussions, and build a Jewish identity that is motivated from the inside,
not from the outside,
and not reactive to the outside. In other words, a Jewish identity that is fostered and based on Jewish resilience and pride, and not a Jewish identity that is reactive to external threats to Jewish life. And only then, I believe, and that's what we're focusing on Birthright Israel, is that if we cultivate such a generation of Jews, one of the outcomes will be is that they will be internally motivated to fight anti-Semitism rather than externally instructed
but
to do
many
so.
people, for instance, may not have gotten to Birthright because they weren't engaged, and now they possibly would when the war's over, etc. So the external threat was what actually pushed them forward. You can't ignore that. And I'll just add one more, waves of Aliyah, immigration to Israel, right? Most people that made Aliyah to Israel did it not necessarily because of Zionism, but because they were fleeing from some place.
Right.
Well, I don't think it's either or.
Right, exactly.
I think it's a combination, and I think one thing is not to make Jews feel apologetic for being Jewish.
Right.
The movement to free Soviet Jews empowered a whole generation of young American Jews
That's
and
true.
Jews around the world.
That was taking something, turning it into a positive. But I want my question to be...
Tragedy as a motivator is a powerful one and always has been in the, let's say, in the arena of the human condition in general, not just Jewish one. The question for an educator and for an educational institution is, regardless of the motivator, what do I do now that I have this participant in their seat? And how do I transform their identity, not to turn this motivator into the byword of their ongoing Jewish identity? And that's what we're trying to do.
So in other ways, in a way, right, there is generations of Jews that were educated about Judaism through the Holocaust, right? It's interesting how I sound American, but I grew up in Israel. Every single kid, Jewish kid who went through Jewish day school, there's certain books, like, from, I forgot the name now, but Night, I think, right? And Elie Wiesel, and there's certain documents that they had to learn, and it's part of their identity. Every single one of them, you'll stop them, right? They read it. So that's part of their identity is this Holocaust, right?
It's more than that, and you've heard me say this before. I think that
I like listening to you. That's why we had you come.
Our story, as I say it, our story is the story of the ever-living people, and our narrative is many a time the narrative of the ever-dying people. And we should change our narrative to correspond with our story. That's the mandate of education, in my opinion.
Okay.
My generation came of age at the height of the Cold War. It was also post, it was the never again, we were the
never
again generation.
Right.
Yeah.
And that translated into, well, if what our parents and grandparents couldn't do for the Jews of Europe, we weren't going to fall in the same place or become the same victims for the Jews in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And that was a strong motivating factor, but it wasn't the only one, because we were also coming, we were coming out of a generation. The post-World War II generation in this country was the first generation of Jews, again, that didn't apologize for being Jewish.
Yeah.
That they were exercising their rights.
Well, not all of them.
No, but a certain enough. And
those who succeeded.
Obviously, a lot had to do with the creation and the founding of the State of Israel, which was also an empowering event for American Jews and Jews around the world.
Right. So how can we turn, Zohar, how can we turn this situation now of a tragedy, right, moving people to either be closer or want to be closer, maybe on the other hand being kind of quiet and internally thinking? How are we able to take that to the next level of being active and strategic, as you said?
I think that we're dealing, when we talk about the Jewish world in general, and especially about young adults, which is my and Birthright Israel's forte, is that we're dealing with what I call a silent majority that increasingly feels as a silenced minority. And we need to do two things from a strategic standpoint on this level. Number one, we need to reassure them and bring to their awareness the fact that they are the majority. In other words, they belong to a majority that really wants to wrestle with issues of Judaism, Israel, and Zionism in a responsible and intelligent manner. And second, we need to empower them and transform them gradually and systematically from a silent majority to a vocal one. And by vocal, I don't mean necessarily chanting a tikva or flaunting flags of Israel blindly, but rather saying in a non-apologetic manner, we want to discuss our Jewish identity and associations with Israel and Zionism responsibly, intelligently, in due context, without being bullied, threatened, or persuaded not to do so.
Right. But, I think there's an opportunity here. And let's face it, up until October 7th, there was a huge gap between young Jews in the diaspora in Israel and with the Jewish community many times. And then, and being critical of Israel. I think now some of them are less critical. Obviously, those in the extreme will be more critical of Israel. But shouldn't we embrace this? There are positivities to the situation. People are getting closer, not for the right reasons, but we were in a bad place. So you want to?
Again, the motivator has been the tragedy. But I truly believe as an educator that we are standing at the threshold of our finest hour as a people if organizations like mine and organizations led by my colleague work together in order to make sure that people re-embrace their Jewish identity, not because of tragedies, but despite of tragedies.
But are organizations working together? Because I could tell you I have a friend in the tech sphere who they were working on some startup regarding anti-Semitism, and they mapped out, all the organizations and everything. And my friend's like, he comes to me, he's like, "You have no idea." I was like, "What?" He's like, "They don't speak to each other." I was like, "Dude,
welcome
to show up business."
There's always been a certain level of cooperation and competition.
Right.
I mean, you can't escape it, particularly in the United States. However,
being the largest Jewish community in most organizations, etc.
It's also, remember, we're a community where we've never embraced the idea of a chief rabbinate.
Right.
And that we don't have a truly single umbrella organization. There are many organizations, but since October 7th, there's been a level and degree of cooperation that I haven't seen in a very long time. Right.
And continuously.
And continuously.
Okay.
And, look, there are always going to be rivalries. There's always going to be some amount of competition, but there are moments in history that are wake-up calls, and October 7th was a wake-up call, and I think unfortunately a few days ago it was another wake-up call, and our ability to work together, I think, has become evident. I think that responding to the counterforces, to those who are promoting hatred, genocide, the removal of the Jewish homeland, are being met with a great deal of resistance, beyond resistance.
But some people would say, maybe there's a failure of the Jewish organizations for not engaging the younger generation, for not educating the younger generation about their identity, about Israel. Now we're in a situation where people are, I wrote about this, where some, let's say a 50-year-old guy from a wealthy family, they've been donating to Holocaust, issues for years, but he never really, his father was the one, he passed away, and now he's like, okay, October 7th, suddenly he's singled out as a Jew. He moved his daughters to a private school because they were being, harassed. And he says, I don't know the organizations. I don't know the Bronfmans or the whatever, all the wealthy families and the organizations. And this is a guy, and he's in his philanthropic hat, but there's many people from other directions who don't have that connection, and maybe we weren't doing enough. And the question: are we doing enough now? Well,
there's always. I don't like using the phrase Monday morning quarterbacking because it doesn't resonate beyond the United States so much. But there's always the ability to second guess.
100%.
And it doesn't mean that second guessing isn't right sometimes. But I think if we look at what's happened over the last year, there have been far more opportunities seized than missed. And I think in terms of a wake-up call for the younger generation, it's been a wake-up call. It's been a wake-up call for kids, for their parents, for their grandparents and others. I firmly believe that, look, we can always do more. The question is, how do we direct that? How do we take the resources that are available now? And there are tremendous amounts of resources available now. How do we utilize those?
Right, but everyone's doing their own thing, which may not be a bad thing.
Not necessarily.
There is, and I think there is a great deal of cooperation. There's a great deal of intersection, and there's integration and parallel tracks. And has it been a perfect response? No, because we've seen what, I hate using this phrase as well, what the other side has been doing.
Yeah.
But the other side has been mobilizing in ways that, again, that we didn't imagine.
Right. But we could have, semi-competed with it because we have, in every university you have all these buildings, right, named for all these Jewish philanthropists. What about the content that's taught inside them?
That's being dealt with now, I think, in ways that hadn't been before.
Mm-hmm.
And
Zohar, you wanna?
First of all,
bail him out of this.
I'm
kidding.
I'm in full agreement. I think I just look at it from a different perspective because I think our perspectives are complementary. First of all, for me, Judaism and Jewish education should never build their foundations on crisis mode. Mm-hmm. And we are at a crisis mode, and we've been on crisis mode for the better part of more than a year now. Mm-hmm. And we should realize that. In other words, I think that the tremendous response of the American and the global Jewish community to what had happened in Israel on October 7th and in the rest of the Western world starting October 8th has been and continues to be remarkable. However, the memory of tragedies eventually dissipate. That's also part of the human condition. And if we do not, again, I hate to say, but if we do not leverage this moment of global Jewish awareness.
No, but I agree with that. I agree with that. We shouldn't be embarrassed to say it.
Exactly. And we need to leverage this moment of unprecedented global Jewish awareness in order to start working, in order never to face another wake-up call. Because when I hear the term wake-up call, which I understand, it actually means indirectly that you were asleep. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to be asleep again.
But we will be,
Hopefully.
Historically, we need that hit on the head every few generations.
You're probably right. But in the interim stages, mm-hmm. I believe that one of the lessons the Jewish world should heed to is that we need much more cooperation, much less redundancy, duplicity.
But can you give me an example of what is being done, being discussed within these rooms, right? And you're in many
First of all,
rooms and forums.
One of the forums that you and I are the Coalition for the Jewish People that we run in Israel, the Jewish People, which does tremendous work. The work that is being in Israel, the work that is being done between organizations such as Birthright Israel and Hillel and Chabad and others on campus and off in IACT and the initiatives by the Jewish Federations of North America.
But do we need a new quote-unquote birthright? Right? Because birthright now has become, don't take offense, part of the establishment. Okay, it wasn't when it started.
A rite of passage in a way, which is a great achievement, I think.
100%. Yeah. So maybe there needs to be that young, different kind of, chutzpah-ish organization or movement of people.
If you talk to Gidi Mark, our CEO, you'll see whom you know very well. You know that chutzpah and rethinking outside the box, that's his forte.
That's his forte, yeah.
Birthright Israel under his leadership never became a rite of passage that kind of thrives on its laurels, but actually reinvents itself all the time. Mm-hmm. And we've been busy reinventing ourselves since October 7th. And I think that in some ways, there's much more work to be done. In other ways, I think we've done great work.
Look, there are
Very diplomatic answer.
There are levels of cooperation among different organizations, among religious streams.
Right.
That and again, it may have started in tragedy. The hope is that it will go beyond that. But the work between the cooperation between federations and national agencies, some of who used to be called the defense agencies, is at an unprecedented level today.
Right.
And look, my movement was started. You know, we started on the outside, and we began. And
became mainstream.
We became mainstream.
Right.
There are many young people in particular who are outside of the mainstream now.
Yeah.
Who are speaking out since October 7th, but are trying to utilize the resources that are available from the mainstream without sacrificing what
they believe in.
What they believe in.
So I wanted to ask you, with relevance to that. So, do you feel, as an American Jew, because Zohar and I are Israelis, so do you feel that Israel, both as a state, but also as a nation or whatever, is doing enough to produce, whether it materials, information, even news, even research, like enough for these young Jews or older Jews who want to tell the story in the way they believe to be so, but don't have the tools?
I think there are more than enough tools being generated from Israel, let alone within the United States. I think it's how we get that information, those resources, those tools out to the people that need them. Look, since the founding of the state, there's been a push-pull relationship with the diaspora, in particular with the American diaspora.
Yeah.
And
and there always will be.
And there always will. I mean, Israelis believe they know
everything.
That they know the American Jewish community as well, if not better. And the American Jewish community is saying that the Israelis don't understand. And will we ever get over that divide? No. But again, I think, as there have been other wake-up calls, this has been one. But we've also, how do we, one question here, and I think it's probably similar in other diaspora communities, how do we expand our outreach beyond the people that we're already in contact with or on the periphery? Because, in the United States, we're talking about, it's still a significant Jewish community that is that's defined in many different ways.
Very different ways.
I'll add to that something, with your permission, because I fully agree with your analysis, but I'm actually from an strategic and educational standpoint, one of the things that can be done in light of what you call this divide, which I acknowledge as well, and we acknowledge as well, is really
Zohar and I not thrive, but we
is the world in which we live.
We live in trying to bridge that divide.
We need to
cultivate in different ways.
Yeah,
and we need to cultivate. The sort of people, both in Israel and in the USA, who are what I call culturally and conceptually bilingual. In other words, it's not just enough to send
100%.
information from Israel, Tzvika. You need to send it in an American way.
You need the nuance.
And the Americans need to talk to Israelis in a language that Israelis can understand.
It's not just English, it's American.
Exactly.
It's not just Hebrew, it's Israeli.
You need moderators between the two continents who are able to speak to both cultures.
And is this just a theory or something that can be?
I think that educational organizations that do work, such as Onward, Birthright Israel, other organizations who do this work on both the shlichut, should aspire to cultivate such educators and people who now become a two-sided bridge between the communities and are able sometimes to translate to the one what the other actually meant when they said
so
what they said.
So when I asked you the question, what I was aiming at, and I'll tell you my opinion, is that Israel did not, when it comes to mainstream news, did not invest, did not do enough to tell our own story because we weren't ready for it. The Prime Minister's office didn't have enough people. The Foreign Ministry which is an internal issue, but has effects all over the world, is not as strong as it used to be. So war breaks out. IDF spokesperson's unit is amazing, doing very good things. Lots of people, whether serving there or doing, their reserve duty. But we don't have spokespeople not on uniform. Barely any, and when we find a few, then they fire them. So
I won't comment on that.
No, but what I'm saying is, the amount of requests for interviews and for briefings was probably at the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and they were able to, we as a country were able to answer maybe few requests. Okay. So that's a big deal. So maybe like one of the solutions is what Zohar is saying, taking the bilinguals and utilizing their efforts. Israel is a country full of people from all over the world. Right. We have people speaking every single language.
Our human capital is one of our greatest assets, and it's not even being remotely.
Exactly. So I feel like if we were giving more, more stats, more human interest stories, more briefings, explanations to all these journalists that came to Israel, I feel like maybe here in America, right, or at other places, the story would be perceived differently.
I think on the margins.
Okay.
No, I really do, because I think that
at the end of the day, there's a narrative.
No, well, there's a narrative, but what you were talking about is what a number of organizations and others were doing. I think that for the most part, the way the story was told, the narrative here, was headed in a positive way, and then it was overwhelmed.
Yeah,
it was overwhelmed. It goes to something that I wanted to raise, and it's the whole information that's inflicted the world, and it's coming primarily from a half a dozen places.
The people that don't like us.
That don't like open and free societies, democracies, the so-called Western world.
Jews,
intellectuals, the tried and true. But what a lot of these state actors are doing is not picking a side. They're working both sides, trying to sow discontent, trying to disrupt what's been in place, so that when tragedies occur or violent actions, they're trying to manage both sides. And we've seen this in successive elections. We've seen this not just in the United States, but elsewhere. We see it in how the Russians are trying to get the message out about why they went into Ukraine. I can't tell you how much time I spent trying to knock down this notion that they were going in trying to defeat a neo-Nazi, fascist, anti-Semitic state.
Yeah.
One of the biggest canards that they pressed here.
I once tweeted something that had, and again, I was not taking sides. Obviously, most Israelis support Ukraine, but I had an exclusive photo of a soldier coming back, and some Jewish soldier took a picture of him on the train, and there was a bag with a swastika. Okay, but I got it from a direct contact, and that tweet was taken by the Russians, and it had a life of its own for months. For months, I've never had millions of impressions. I've never had anything like that, because it's taking a specific thing, oh look, right, and that becomes
part of their narrative is that Ukraine was persecuting Christians, let alone Jews.
Right.
And the impact that it had in this country on the evangelical
community.
Parts of the evangelical community was huge.
That's so interesting.
And it took, I can't tell you what the effort was to counter that and to get people in this country, evangelicals and in particular, but others as well, to understand that the level of religious freedom is so much greater in the country that was invaded as opposed to the invaders.
Right. It was a narrative that was very difficult to
and this has spilled over to anti-Semitism.
Yeah. So you mentioned this in a half sentence, and I think this is something that Zohar could definitely relate to. It's kind of my half hobby is diasporas, not Jewish diaspora, but it's a fascinating thing. So I actually once went with Gidi Mark, the CEO of Birthright, to Lithuania. They had a state-sponsored conference, and they wanted to learn from different countries. And one of the things they wanted to learn about was from Birthright, because they have a huge decrease. People leaving the country, young people, and they want to bring them back or have them be affiliated. So Zohar, how are other countries, dealing with this type of situation? I think it's fascinating.
It is fascinating, and you're right that they kind of look at the Jewish people
as a model, as
a model of diaspora, which is really, really unique. I mean,
including by the way,
forced upon us, but
like from South Korea, they'll come and they want to learn.
It's
if you want to have a story about that,
Ireland, Macedonia, Lithuania. I was there with
Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan. They want to understand how to engage their expatriates in a manner that pretty much comes and says to them, you have a homeland irrespective of the land which is your home right now.
Right.
And how do you build this kind of relationship?
Did you see anything that was different than what we're doing, that was successful or out of the box?
It's a very, very different context.
Yeah, well, every country is different.
First of all, they're much less, forgive me for saying it, but they're much less proficient in the language of crisis,
right,
than we are.
Yeah,
it's our DNA. For objective and historical reasons. So they are still in the process of shaping a language around the need itself. In other words, what is the position of an expatriate vis-a-vis their homeland, and why should we have a relationship with them? And for their expatriates, it's a mother country, motherland, but it's a very, very different context than the Jewish context, which is embedded in ancient texts, in history, in liturgy, in tradition.
So it's a lot more cultural based,
much more
maybe religious, depending on
to a certain level. Yes.
Right.
Well, you look at the Armenian American community.
Yeah, that's a good example.
They took their lessons from the American Jewish community. I can't tell you how many diasporas, let alone governments, have come into our office and said, teach us. I said, I'll give you one quick example outside of the region, but only in China can a religion that has 100 million followers be called a religious minority.
Okay.
And the Falun Gong. And this goes back a number of years, but they came into our office and they said, teach us. How did you do what you did? Because we want to learn.
You know, The Jew in the Lotus, that's a classic example about the Dalai Lama, right? The book of The Jew in the Lotus that wanted to learn from rabbis in America.
Yeah.
How do you manage a life in the diaspora, in Galut, in exile, and sustain the vitality of my people?
That's fascinating. So we have to round up. So happy for every one of you to kind of summarize and think of looking forward. How should we be, combating anti-Semitism? But I think what we all agree upon is it's not just the act itself. It's really, I think, the education or the knowledge, the affiliation, the connection to Israel and to the Jewish people that will already make them be strong and sustainable.
Look, I think our biggest challenge, well, I should say, one of our biggest challenges is that we don't defeat ourselves from within. If we look at the history of our people,
in Israel, it's
historically.
Yeah. No, but I'm saying in Israel now, past few months, weeks, it's already, getting to back to the them and us type of situation.
No, without doubt. I think that we have to continue to look for those areas that we can cooperate on, but we also have to be honest, and we have to deal whether there's certain issues in Israel that have been left unresolved and need to be addressed. There are issues in this country, let alone other diasporas, that we haven't swept under the carpet because of October 7th. But as I said to an ambassador from Eastern Europe after the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, I said there's certain issues that have been left unresolved. It doesn't mean that they've gone away.
Right.
If there ever is a conclusion to this war, then we're going to come back and address those issues because they haven't gone away and they need to be resolved.
Okay, that's interesting.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I would add that we need to be very conscious of the fact that on the one hand, the global Jewish community and its non-Jewish allies need to be much more rigorous and unapologetic about fighting anti-Semitism as an unacceptable form of social discourse, period. And at the same time, not allow anti-Semitism become the byword of our Jewish identity formation. In other words, there are two parallel tracks here where each one does very important work, but we should not let them merge into one another, because if we do the latter, it could have destructive ramifications on Jewish identity for generations to come.
Right. So I think what I'm going to take from this conversation, I liked, your theory about the people who are bilingual, or bicultural. And I think that's something that really needs to be kind of elevated, because there's so many people like that, but they're not necessarily, they don't know where to go or how to do it. So I think those types of people really need to be given some sort of a platform or a way
to facilitate
to facilitate what's within them.
Absolutely.
That's it. They don't have to, they know the two cultures. They just have to, kind of translate it to each other.
And in doing it in a way that doesn't make them feel inferior to
100%.
others.
Absolutely.
100%.
Absolutely.
So we all agree about that. So thank you, Dr. Zohar Raviv, and thank you, Mark Levin, for coming to the studio here in Washington. And let's hope we meet in better terms.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.